Jessica Chen stood ramrod straight in the pouring rain, her service cap soaked through, her uniform clinging to her shoulders as the commander called for salutes during the Naval Academy graduation ceremony. When hundreds of hands snapped up, in unison, hers remained fixed at her side. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to the valedictorian, who refused to salute. The admiral's voice faltered mid-speech. Security personnel shifted nervously. But Jessica's gaze remained locked forward, her expression resolute despite the raindrops streaming down her face. This single act of defiance would soon shake the foundations of the military establishment and change how America viewed its most sacred traditions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Jessica had been polishing brass insignias in her dormitory when Commander Michael Harrison knocked on her door. She glanced up to see the decorated officer studying her perfectly arranged room with the appreciation of someone who understood military precision. Most cadets kept their quarters tidy, following regulations with dutiful attention. But Jessica arranged her space with a mathematical exactness that seemed almost superhuman. Every item positioned at perfect right angles, her uniform hanging exactly 4 inches from the closet edge, books aligned by height down to the millimeter. "Cadet Chen," Harrison said, examining the row of academic achievement medals displayed on her desk. "I was hoping we could talk about your final paper." The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the spotless floor of the dormitory where Jessica had spent 3 years rising through the ranks at West Point Naval Academy. Her father's military compass sat precisely centered on her desk, a family artifact from a man whose naval career had ended before she was born. When the commander approached her desk, Jessica noticed the careful way he carried himself. Shoulders perfectly squared, each step measured, eyes constantly evaluating. He placed a folder on her desk with deliberate care. "Jessica Chen," he introduced himself formally, extending a hand that felt firm but not aggressive. First in her class, perfect academic scores, flawless discipline record. Jessica wiped her hands on her uniform pants before accepting the handshake. "Just doing what's expected, sir." She gestured around the modest room with its spare decorations and regulation furniture. "This place isn't exactly what you'd call personalized." Harrison's eyes swept the room again, but this time Jessica realized he wasn't just looking, he was assessing. His gaze lingered on her meticulously organized desk, the way she'd arranged her textbooks by subject and frequency of use, the careful system she'd developed for tracking her academic progress. "Personalization isn't about appearances," he said quietly. "It's about integrity. And from what I can see, you understand integrity better than most." As Commander Harrison began discussing her paper on military ethics, Jessica felt him watching her every reaction. She had developed her own approach to military studies over the years, first examining historical precedent, then evaluating current applications, each analysis placed in a specific framework of ethical considerations. Her father had instilled this process during the few years she'd known him before his deployment and subsequent disappearance. "You write about duty like someone who's been serving for decades," Harrison observed, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Jessica smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've never even been deployed, not officially anyway." She continued organizing her notes with practiced efficiency. "My dad always said he'd show me what real service meant when I was ready, but..." She shrugged, not finishing the sentence. Some conversations were too heavy for a first meeting with a superior officer. Harrison leaned against the wall, studying her with renewed interest. "Never deployed? Not even in simulation exercises?" Jessica held up her ethics paper, adjusting it under her desk lamp. "Dad was very particular about preparation." said military service was something you understood properly, or not at all. He was planning to explain his theories about duty when I turned 16, but he disappeared during a classified operation that spring. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of cadets marching outside. Jessica had become comfortable with these silences over the years. Commanders often shared more than they intended when discussing assignments that held personal significance. Harrison's interest in her paper clearly fell into that category. "The ethical framework you've developed is remarkable," Harrison said, running his finger along a paragraph she'd written about the tension between orders and moral responsibility. "Whoever taught you these principles knew what they were doing. The moral calculations have to be perfectly consistent at this level." Jessica straightened slightly. "You can tell that just from reading my paper? The reasoning patterns, the way you structure your arguments. Someone taught you to think about military duty differently. Every citation, every historical reference tells me something about how you've been trained to understand service." Jessica continued explaining her position, noting the intense focus Harrison maintained despite the theoretical nature of their discussion. "This framework has applications beyond academic exercises. It allows for consistent ethical decision-making under extreme pressure." "And what applications would those be?" Jessica paused, realizing she was about to venture into territory she'd only explored in theoretical discussions with her ethics professor. Real-world moral conflicts. When orders contradict constitutional principles. When the chain of command requires actions that violate international law. When following protocol means abandoning those who served alongside you. She calculated quickly, considering the ethical implications. This framework allows for principled decision-making in scenarios where standard military procedure fails the moral test. Harrison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What if I told you the right application of these principles could fundamentally transform military culture?" Something in his tone made Jessica look up from her papers. Harrison was watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how isolated her position was as a top cadet. How few people understood the conflicts she'd been quietly wrestling with throughout her education. "I'd say that would depend entirely on who applies them," she replied carefully, returning to her papers, but keeping Harrison in her peripheral vision. Harrison smiled for the first time since entering her room, and Jessica realized that somehow, without meaning to, she'd just passed some kind of test. Harrison returned exactly 3 days later, but his official demeanor had changed. Jessica noticed immediately the careful way he entered, the deliberate pause as he surveyed the room, the manila folder tucked under his arm. This wasn't a commander's visit. This was something else entirely. "Your paper has been submitted and graded." Jessica called from her desk where she'd been organizing her father's old letters. "Perfect score, as expected. Though I have to say, your feedback was minimal." "That would be because we need to discuss it further," Harrison replied. But he made no move toward her desk. Instead, he wandered over to a small shelf containing her father's personal effects. Items that had been returned after his mission was classified as failed, each one representing a different aspect of his military philosophy. "Tell me about your father." The question caught Jessica off guard. In 3 years at the academy, instructors rarely asked about her personal life. They wanted her assignments completed perfectly and promptly, nothing more. "What do you want to know?" Harrison stopped in front of a tarnished compass that her father had carried through 3 tours. "I did some research after our conversation." Lieutenant Commander James Chen, Navy Cross recipient, specialized in deep cover operations, developed the Chen Protocol for ethical decision-making in compromised field situations. Disappeared during Operation Nightfall in 2018. Jessica's hands stilled on the letters. Few people knew about her father's specialized work, and even fewer understood the significance of his contributions to military ethics. You've done your homework. I'm curious about something, Harrison continued, turning to face her directly. A man who dedicated his life to military ethics, who helped write the modern rules of engagement, never taught his own daughter to unquestioningly follow orders. The observation stung because Jessica had asked herself the same question countless times. He was protective. Said blind obedience wasn't the same as service, that it required maturity and moral courage. He wanted to wait until I was old enough to understand the responsibility. Harrison nodded slowly, then opened the manila folder he'd been carrying. I've been thinking about our conversation, about integrity, about moral reasoning, about the difference between technical compliance and genuine ethical service. He pulled out a photograph and placed it on her desk. Jessica leaned forward to examine it. The image showed what appeared to be a military operation gone wrong. Bodies of civilians lying in the aftermath of what looked like an airstrike. Numbers were written in the margin. Operation Cobalt, 2023, coordinates 34, 521, 18, 338, classified. That's a current black operation in North Africa, Harrison said quietly. Officially, it doesn't exist. Officially, those civilians were never killed. Officially, the United States military has no presence in that region. Jessica studied the photograph, her mind automatically calculating the implications. Chain of command responsibility, international law violations, the moral weight of covered-up civilian casualties. This operation was authorized at the highest levels, Harrison continued. The mission parameters explicitly accepted civilian casualties as acceptable collateral damage to eliminate a suspected terrorist cell. The intelligence was faulty. The cell wasn't there. But the mission was declared a success anyway. Why are you showing me this? Jessica's voice was barely audible. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Because I think you could change it all. Jessica stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. I'm sorry, what? I've been thinking about it for months. Your ethical framework, your understanding of military duty, your father's protocols. Most importantly, the way you approach moral problems. Harrison gestured toward her meticulously organized desk. You have something most officers never develop, an intuitive understanding of the relationship between moral principles and practical action. Commander Harrison, I'm just a cadet. I've never even been deployed. Exactly. His eyes gleamed with something between excitement and certainty. Do you know what the biggest obstacle is for most military reformers? Institutional inertia? Complicity. They've already compromised too many times. They've already looked the other way. They've already saluted when they should have questioned. By the time they reach positions of influence, they're too embedded in the system to change it. Jessica felt a flutter of something she couldn't identify. Part fear, part curiosity. You're serious about this? Dead serious. I've trained dozens of officers. I've seen natural talent, and I've seen technical expertise, but I've never seen someone who combines theoretical knowledge with completely untainted moral instincts. Harrison leaned against her desk, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Your father's methods, his understanding of ethical duty, you've absorbed all of that without the interference of practical compromise. This is insane, Jessica said. But she found herself looking at the photograph again. Even if what you're suggesting were possible, which it isn't, why would you want to help me? Harrison was quiet for so long that Jessica wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Because I spent my entire adult life following orders I knew were wrong. It's something I'll never forgive myself for. I think I just met someone who might do better. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of cadets drilling on the parade ground. Jessica stared at the photograph, her mind racing through ethical calculations she'd only ever done theoretically. The moral burden was impossible. The institutional resistance would be overwhelming. And yet, if I were to hypothetically consider this completely ridiculous idea, she said slowly, where would we even start? Harrison smiled, and Jessica realized that somehow, without meaning to, she'd just agreed to something that would change her life forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The naval graduation rehearsal took place 3 weeks before the actual ceremony. Located on the sprawling parade grounds where generations of officers had received their commissions, it was here that Jessica first tested her resolve. As instructors walked cadets through the precise timing of the ceremony, she deliberately kept her hand at her side during the salute practice. "Cadet Chen," barked Lieutenant Coleman, his face reddening, "your salute. This isn't optional." Jessica maintained her position. "Sir, I'm experiencing some shoulder discomfort. Medical issue." Coleman's eyes narrowed, but he moved on, making a note on his clipboard. Later that day, Harrison found Jessica in the library, surrounded by military regulations and constitutional law texts. "Testing the waters already?" he asked quietly, sliding into the chair across from her. "Just seeing how they react to small deviations," Jessica replied without looking up. The lieutenant made a note, but didn't escalate. Interesting that physical incapacity is accepted without question, but moral objection would be treated as insubordination. Harrison nodded. "The system accommodates physical limitations, but not ethical ones. That's precisely the problem." Over the following weeks, Jessica and Harrison met regularly, always carefully, always under the guise of graduation preparation or academic advising. They studied historical cases of military disobedience that had changed history, the officers who refused illegal orders at My Lai, the commanders who questioned strategic bombing in Vietnam, the service members who leaked evidence of prisoner abuse. "What you're planning goes beyond all of these," Harrison warned during one late-night session in his office. A public refusal to salute at graduation would be seen as a direct challenge to military authority itself. Jessica stared at the wall, where Harrison had pinned maps showing active military operations, many of them unknown to the American public, some with civilian casualty figures that had never been disclosed. "That's exactly the point," she said quietly. "The salute isn't just a gesture of respect. It's a symbol of unquestioning obedience. It represents the moment when individual moral judgment is surrendered to the chain of command." Harrison studied her with growing concern. The dedicated cadet who had once sought perfect scores had become someone who spoke in constitutional principles and ethical imperatives. Her transformation was impressive, but it was also consuming her future in ways that worried him. "Jessica, do you understand what this will cost you? Your commission, your career, possibly even criminal charges. Do you know what my father told me before his last deployment?" She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "He said, Jess, sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse an order." Jessica spent the night before graduation alone in her room, reviewing her father's journals. His writings on the moral foundations of military service had become increasingly troubled in his final years. He had begun questioning operations he'd participated in, documenting ethical breaches that had been classified as national security matters. In his final entry, he'd written, "I fear I've served a system, not my country. True patriotism may require me to stand against what I've helped build." He had disappeared 3 days later. As the morning sun rose on graduation day, Jessica dressed carefully in her formal uniform. Each button, each crease, each insignia perfectly positioned according to regulations. If she was going to challenge the system, she would do so while honoring its standards of excellence. Harrison found her outside the assembly area, standing slightly apart from the excited graduates preparing to receive their commissions. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly. Jessica looked past him to where families were already gathering in the stands, where flags snapped in the morning breeze, where the military band was preparing for the ceremony. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "The first person to refuse an unjust order always stands alone. But they rarely stay alone for long." Harrison nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Jessica said. "Because after today, his name and mine will be linked forever." As the graduates lined up for the processional, Jessica took her place at the front of the formation. As valedictorian, she would be prominently visible throughout the ceremony, her every move watched by military leadership, fellow graduates, and hundreds of spectators. The sky darkened as they marched onto the field, and the first drops of rain began to fall just as the national anthem concluded. By the time the admiral took the podium, a steady downpour had begun, but military tradition dictated that the ceremony would continue regardless of weather. Jessica stood perfectly still as the rain soaked through her uniform, focusing on her breathing, on the weight of her decision, on the faces of the civilian families watching from the stands, the people whom the military ultimately served. "When I call for the ceremonial salute," the admiral announced, "you will officially transition from cadets to commissioned officers of the United States Navy." Jessica felt a sudden clarity as the moment approached. The rain, the ceremony, the years of preparation, all of it seemed to fade into the background as she focused on the simple moral choice before her: to raise her hand or keep it at her side, to continue the system or challenge it, to honor her father's uniform or his principles. Graduates present arms. Hundreds of hands snapped up in perfect unison, a choreographed display of discipline and obedience, all except one. Jessica Chen stood immobile, her arm firmly at her side, her gaze fixed forward as gasps rippled through the crowd and the admiral's voice faltered. In that moment of defiance, everything changed. The rain continued to fall, washing over the parade ground, over the confused faces of military brass, over the still form of a single cadet who had decided that true service sometimes required the courage to stand apart. The silence following Jessica's refusal to salute lasted only seconds, but it stretched like an eternity across the rain-soaked parade ground. Commander Harrison watched from the side, his face an unreadable mask as security personnel began moving toward Jessica's position. The ceremony meticulously planned over. Months had suddenly veered into uncharted territory. "Cadet Chen," the admiral's voice crackled through the speakers, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Present arms immediately." Jessica remained motionless, rain streaming down her face, her expression resolute. "This is a direct order, cadet." When Jessica finally spoke, her voice carried across the field with surprising clarity. "Sir, with respect, I cannot in good conscience participate in a gesture that symbolizes unquestioning obedience when that obedience has been used to shield war crimes." The collective intake of breath from the assembled graduates was audible even over the rainfall. Phones emerged from beneath umbrellas as civilians in the audience began recording. Military police officers flanked Jessica on both sides, awaiting orders. The admiral's face darkened. "Remove Cadet Chen from the field. Ceremony suspended for 15 minutes. As security personnel escorted Jessica from the parade ground, the expressions on their faces reflected the confusion rippling through the ranks. This wasn't a protest against policy or a political statement. This was a challenge to the foundational principle of military hierarchy itself. Jessica was led to a small administrative building adjacent to the parade ground. Inside, senior officers gathered in a hastily convened meeting, their voices raised in heated debate about how to proceed. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of their argument. "Court-martial. Media already has footage. Can't just ignore. Her record is perfect." Outside, the rain continued to fall on hundreds of graduates and their families, now buzzing with speculation about what had just happened. News crews that had come to film a routine graduation ceremony suddenly found themselves covering a breaking story. The door opened, and Admiral Prescott entered, flanked by the Academy's legal officer and Commander Harrison. The Admiral's expression was granite. "Cadet Chen, I'm giving you one opportunity to explain yourself before I determine the appropriate disciplinary action." Jessica straightened to attention but kept her arms at her sides. "Sir, I believe the military's highest duty is to the Constitution and to ethical conduct, not to unquestioning obedience. The salute represents submission to authority without moral consideration." "This is about more than a gesture," Prescott said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is about the foundation of military discipline." "Yes, sir, it is," Jessica replied. "And that foundation must be ethical integrity, not blind compliance." Harrison stepped forward. "Sir, if I may." "You may not, Commander," Prescott cut him off sharply. "I suspect we'll be discussing your involvement separately." He turned back to Jessica. "Cadet Chen, you're facing serious charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Until a formal hearing can be arranged, you are confined to quarters." As Jessica was escorted from the room, Harrison caught her eye briefly. In that momentary glance, she saw both concern and something else, a quiet pride that confirmed she hadn't stood alone, even if it had appeared that way. News of Jessica's defiance spread like wildfire through military and civilian channels alike. By evening, footage of her silent refusal had been viewed millions of times, sparking intense debate across social media platforms, news networks, and within the military itself. The Academy attempted to control the narrative, issuing a terse statement describing the incident as an unfortunate breach of protocol by a cadet experiencing personal difficulties. But the story had already outgrown their ability to contain it. Jessica sat alone in her dormitory, now under guard, watching through her window as reporters gathered at the Academy gates. Her phone had been confiscated, her internet access restricted, but she could still hear the helicopters circling overhead, media aircraft trying to capture footage of the campus in turmoil. A knock at her door preceded the entrance of Dr. Eleanor Winters, the Academy's chief psychologist. "Cadet Chen," she said, settling into the chair across from Jessica's bed. "I've been asked to evaluate your mental state." Jessica couldn't help but smile at the predictability of the response. "They think I'm having a breakdown. Are you?" Dr. Winters asked, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp with assessment. "No, ma'am. I'm having a moment of clarity." Dr. Winters consulted her tablet. "Your file shows no previous disciplinary issues. Perfect academic record. Commendations from every instructor." Then suddenly, this very public act of insubordination. She looked up. Something changed. Jessica considered her words carefully. "Not changed, Doctor. Crystallized." For the next hour, Dr. Winters probed Jessica's motivations, her family history, her understanding of military obligations. Jessica answered each question directly but revealed nothing about Harrison's involvement or the classified material she'd seen. "Your father's disappearance," Dr. Winters said finally. "How much does this relate to him?" Jessica looked at the compass still sitting on her desk, the last item of her father's that hadn't been confiscated for security review. "Everything relates to him," she admitted. "But not in the way you think. This isn't about grief or revenge. It's about continuing his work." Dr. Winters made a final note on her tablet. "The disciplinary board will want my assessment by morning. Is there anything else you'd like me to include?" Jessica met her gaze directly. "Just that I'm prepared to accept the consequences of my actions, whatever they may be." After Dr. Winters left, Jessica stood at her window watching the last light fade from the sky. The rain had stopped, but puddles still dotted the parade ground where her classmates had received their commissions without her. Tomorrow they would begin their careers as officers. Her future remained uncertain. Her door opened again without a knock. This time, it was a junior officer she didn't recognize. "Cadet Chen, you have a visitor. 5 minutes." To Jessica's surprise, Admiral Catherine Rivera stepped into the room. A decorated 40-year veteran, Rivera was the highest-ranking woman in the Navy and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her presence at the Academy for the graduation ceremony had been considered an honor. Now her face was solemn as she studied Jessica. "Do you understand what you've done, Cadet?" Jessica stood at attention. "Yes, Admiral." "I don't think you do," Rivera said, walking slowly around the small room. "You've created a situation that cannot be easily resolved. The traditional response would be court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time." She paused. "But nothing about this situation is traditional." Jessica remained silent, waiting. "The footage of your protest has been viewed 27 million times in less than 8 hours. #SaluteTruth is trending globally. Veterans groups are divided, with some condemning you and others defending your action. Congress is already calling for hearings." Rivera's expression remained unreadable. "You've started something that cannot be contained by normal disciplinary channels." "I didn't do this for attention, Admiral." "Perhaps not, but you have it now. The question is, what do you intend to do with it?" The question caught Jessica off guard. She had expected threats, not strategic discussion. "I want to spark a conversation about ethical duty versus blind obedience," she said carefully. "About the moral responsibilities that should guide military service." Rivera nodded slowly. "Noble goals. But let me be clear, you've made powerful enemies today. People who believe questioning authority undermines the entire military structure. People who will do everything possible to discredit you, silence you, and make an example of you. I understand that risk, Admiral. Do you?" Rivera stepped closer. "Because I'm not sure you realize how this will escalate. This isn't just about one ceremony or one salute. You've challenged the fundamental power dynamic of the military establishment." Jessica met the Admiral's gaze. "With respect, ma'am, maybe that dynamic needs challenging." Something flickered in Rivera's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or reluctant admiration. "The disciplinary board meets tomorrow at 0800. I suggest you prepare carefully." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father was a good man, Cadet. Controversial, but principled. I see much of him in you." After Rivera left, Jessica sat on her bed, turning her father's compass over in her hands. The small gesture of support from someone so senior in the chain of command was unexpected and confusing. Was it possible that her act of defiance had resonated with others beyond Harrison? Morning brought a crowd that had swelled overnight. Hundreds of protesters now gathered outside the Academy gates, some supporting Jessica, others condemning her. Military police had been reinforced by local law enforcement to maintain order as the media presence grew larger and more insistent. Jessica was escorted to the administration building under heavy guard, moving through back corridors to avoid the press. The disciplinary board, 5 senior officers, and the Academy's legal counsel waited in a conference room that had been hastily converted for the hearing. Admiral Prescott presided, his expression grim as Jessica was brought before them. "This proceeding will determine the appropriate response to Cadet Chen's actions during yesterday's commissioning ceremony." Swung in her direction as she reached the fence separating the Academy grounds from the public gathering. Civil liberties attorneys rushed forward, phones recording to ensure whatever happened next would be documented. "Cadet Chen, one of them." Reporters called out, "Can you tell us why you refused to salute?" Jessica gripped the fence, facing the cameras directly, her voice steady as she prepared to explain her stand to a nation that was already divided over its meaning. Behind her, alarms continued to sound across the Academy grounds as security forces realized she had escaped confinement. Time seemed to slow as Jessica formulated her response, knowing that her next words would either galvanize a movement for military accountability, or be dismissed as the misguided protest of a single cadet. The cameras captured her image as spotlights. From news helicopters illuminated her position, making her impossible to disappear, impossible to silence. "I refuse to salute," she began, "because true service requires more than obedience. It demands integrity." The media frenzy that erupted as Jessica spoke through the academy fence became the defining image of what newspapers would later call the integrity stand. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights creating a surreal glow around her as she addressed the nation directly for the first time. "I believe in military service," Jessica continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I believe in sacrifice and duty and honor. But I also believe that those values mean nothing if they're used to shield unethical actions from accountability." Security personnel were approaching rapidly from multiple directions, but the cameras were rolling, live streaming to millions. Whatever happened next would happen in full public view. "Operation Cobalt is just one example," Jessica said, speaking quickly now. "A classified mission where civilian casualties were deliberately covered up. The officers who questioned it were silenced. The evidence was buried under national security classifications." She gripped the fence tighter as security reached her position. "My father disappeared trying to expose similar operations. Lieutenant Commander James Chen didn't desert, or defect as the official record states." His strong hands pulled her away from the fence, but her words had already reached the public. As security officers led her away, attorneys on the other side of the fence shouted legal advice while journalists called out questions that went unanswered. Jessica was transported directly to Naval Station Norfolk, bypassing the Academy's disciplinary system entirely. The military's response had escalated from campus security to full federal custody, a clear indication of how seriously they viewed the situation. She spent 3 days in isolation, permitted only brief conversations with military attorneys, who seemed more interested in determining what classified information she possessed than in representing her interests. No civilian counsel was permitted, despite repeated requests. On the 4th day, she was surprised when Admiral Rivera entered her small holding room, dismissing the guards with a sharp gesture. "You've created quite the situation, Miss Chen," Rivera said, deliberately using a civilian form of address. "The footage from the Academy fence has been viewed by over 100 million people. #Integrity Stand is trending in 47 countries. Veterans are staging protests at military bases across the country." Jessica remained seated, her posture military perfect despite her circumstances. "And Operation Cobalt?" Rivera's expression tightened. "A congressional inquiry has been opened. The Secretary of Defense is facing difficult questions. Several officers have requested whistleblower protection to testify." "Then something good has come from this." "That depends on your perspective," Rivera replied. "Many see this as a dangerous breakdown in military discipline. Others view it as necessary accountability. The debate is raging at every level of command." Jessica studied the admiral carefully. "Why are you here, ma'am?" Rivera took a seat across from her. "Because we've reached an inflection point. How this proceeds will determine military culture for a generation. The traditional approach would be to court-martial you, make an example of you, reassert the primacy of the chain of command. And the non-traditional approach? That's what I've come to discuss." Rivera leaned forward. "The Joint Chiefs are divided. Some want to crush this movement before it spreads. Others believe there's merit in examining how we handle ethical conflicts within the ranks." Jessica felt a flicker of hope for the first time since her arrest. "You're suggesting a compromise?" "I'm suggesting a conversation," Rivera corrected. "One that includes your voice rather than silencing it. But first, I need to know what you actually want." The question caught Jessica off guard. In the rush of events, she had focused on exposing the truth, not on defining a positive outcome. I want a military where ethical service isn't seen as contradicting. Discipline, she said after a moment's thought. Where questioning potentially unlawful orders is treated as fulfilling our oath to the Constitution, not as insubordination. Rivera nodded slowly. Lofty goals. More specifically, what would that look like in practice? Jessica had given this considerable thought during her confinement. A formal review process for ethically questionable operations. Whistleblower protections. That actually work. Training that emphasizes moral reasoning alongside tactical skills. And for yourself? What outcome do you seek personally? Jessica met the admiral's gaze directly. Justice for my father. The truth about his disappearance. After that, she shrugged. I never expected to have a military career after this. Rivera stood, pacing the small room. There's a meeting tomorrow at the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, congressional leadership, and representatives from veteran service organizations. They're discussing how to respond to this situation. And you're telling me this because? Because I'm offering you a seat at that table, Rivera said. Not as a gesture of goodwill, but because excluding your voice would only validate your criticisms about how the military handles dissent. Jessica stared at the admiral in disbelief. You want me to address the Joint Chiefs after refusing to salute and exposing classified operations? Want is a strong word, Rivera said with the hint of a smile. But the alternative is watching this debate unfold without your input, which serves neither your goals nor the military's best interests. After Rivera left, Jessica paced her holding room, trying to process this unexpected development. The military establishment was offering her a voice rather than simply punishing her disobedience. It represented either a genuine opening for reform or a sophisticated attempt to co-opt and neutralize her protest. The next morning, Jessica was transported to the Pentagon under heavy security. The contrast between her previous confinement and current treatment was stark. She was given a fresh uniform, permitted to shower and prepare properly, and treated with professional courtesy by her escorts. The conference room where the meeting would take place was already filled when she arrived. Military brass in full-dress uniforms sat alongside civilian leadership in suits. The tension in the room was palpable as Jessica was escorted to an empty chair at the massive table. Secretary of Defense Williams opened the session, his expression grave. We are here to address a situation unprecedented in modern military history. The public refusal of a cadet to participate in the ceremonial salute has evolved into a national debate about military ethics, classified operations, and the nature of service itself. He gestured toward Jessica. Miss Chen's actions have forced U.S. to confront questions that many would prefer to leave unexamined. Rather than simply disciplining her and moving on, we've chosen to engage with the substantive issues she has raised. Admiral Prescott, representing the traditional viewpoint, spoke next. While I appreciate the Secretary's approach, I must emphasize that military discipline cannot function if individual service members feel entitled to pick and choose which orders to obey based on personal moral judgments. With respect, Admiral. Jessica interjected, surprising herself with her boldness. The Uniform Code already requires us to disobey unlawful orders. The question isn't whether moral judgment has a place in military service. It's how we develop and apply that judgment. Properly. The room fell silent at her interruption. Secretary Williams raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. The current system places the full burden of moral decision-making on individual service members, often the most junior ones, while simultaneously punishing them for exercising that judgment, Jessica explained. We need structural reforms that distribute that responsibility more effectively. A veteran service organization representative leaned forward. What specific reforms are you suggesting, Ms. Chen? Jessica had prepared for this question during the night. First, an independent ethics review board for classified operations, composed of both military and civilian experts. Second, enhanced whistleblower protections that can't be circumvented by classification. Third, revised training for all personnel that emphasizes ethical decision-making in complex situations. A congressman interrupted. And who would decide? What's ethical? These sound like mechanisms to undermine military authority in the name of subjective moral judgments. Cadet, do you wish to make a statement before we begin? Jessica stepped forward. Sir, I respectfully request that this hearing be made public. Murmurs rippled through the room. Prescott's eyes narrowed. That is not standard procedure for disciplinary matters. This is not a standard situation, sir, Jessica replied. If the concern is military discipline, then let the public hear the arguments on both sides. Transparency serves truth. Denied, Prescott said flatly. This is an internal military matter. The hearing proceeded with clinical efficiency. Evidence was presented, video footage of her refusal, her academic record, statements from instructors. Dr. Winters delivered her psychological assessment, carefully neutral but hinting at the possibility of emotional distress related to her father's disappearance. When Jessica was finally permitted to speak in her own defense, she rose slowly, conscious of the weight of the moment. I stand before you today not as someone who disrespects military service, but as someone who believes in its highest ideals. The uniform we wear represents a sacred trust with the American people, a promise that our actions will defend not just their safety, but the constitutional principles that define our nation. She paused, looking directly at each member of the COV board. The military salute is more than a gesture of respect. It symbolizes the surrender of individual moral judgment to the chain of command. Throughout history, that surrender has been used to justify actions that violate our most fundamental ethical obligations. One of the board members leaned forward. Are you suggesting that military personnel should pick and choose which orders to obey, Cadet? I'm suggesting that we already do, sir. The Uniform Code of Military Justice requires us to disobey unlawful orders. The Nuremberg Principles establish that following orders is not a defense for war crimes. The question isn't whether we should question orders, it's how we develop the moral courage to do so when necessary. Jessica withdrew a folder from her uniform. I would like to submit evidence regarding Operation Cobalt, a classified mission in North Africa where civilian casualties were deliberately covered up. This operation represents exactly the kind of moral failure that occurs when obedience is valued over integrity. Admiral Prescott's hand slammed down on the table. That operation is classified, Cadet. Any discussion of it is forbidden in this setting. That's exactly the problem, sir, Jessica replied calmly. When wrongdoing is classified, accountability becomes impossible. This hearing is about your insubordination, not policy disputes, Prescott said, his voice rising. Your actions undermined military discipline at a public ceremony. The motivation is irrelevant. With respect, Admiral, motivation is everything, Jessica countered. If we don't examine why service members might feel morally compelled to refuse certain orders, will never address the underlying issues. The tension in the room was palpable as the board members exchanged glances. Whatever they had expected from this hearing, Jessica's composed, principled defense wasn't it. Admiral Rivera, who had observed silently until now, finally spoke. Cadet Chen, regardless of your intentions, do you acknowledge that your actions could encourage others to disobey lawful orders? Jessica considered the question carefully. Admiral, I believe my actions might encourage others to consider the moral dimensions of their service. If that leads to refusing truly unlawful or unethical orders, I would consider that a positive outcome. Prescott's face darkened. This hearing is adjourned for deliberation. Cadet Chen will be returned to confinement. As Jessica was escorted from the room, she caught sight of Commander Harrison watching from the doorway, his expression troubled but resolute. Whatever happened next, she was no longer alone in her stand. The board's deliberations continued for hours as the situation outside the academy gates grew more chaotic. Veterans groups had arrived in force, some supporting Jessica's stand for ethical service, others condemning what they saw as disrespect to military tradition. News helicopters circled continuously, broadcasting live updates to a nation increasingly divided over the meaning of her protest. Inside her dormitory, Jessica waited, mentally preparing for the most likely outcome: dishonorable discharge, possibly criminal charges. She was surprised when, shortly after sunset, her door opened to reveal not guards, but Commander Harrison. "We need to move quickly," he said, his voice low. "The board is deadlocked, but Prescott is pushing for maximum penalties. More importantly, someone leaked information about Operation Cobalt to the press. The Pentagon is in damage control mode." Jessica stood, alarmed. I know," Harrison interrupted. "But someone did. And now there's concern that you might have other classified information. There's talk of transferring you to a military detention facility for security reasons." "They can't just disappear me," Jessica said, though her father's fate suggested otherwise. "They can try," Harrison replied grimly. "Which is why we need to get you in front of the media immediately. Public visibility is your only protection now." Jessica hesitated. "That would mean burning all bridges. No chance of salvaging my military career." "That bridge was burned the moment you kept your hand down," Harrison said. "The question now is whether your stand will matter or be buried in classified proceedings." Before Jessica could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the campus. Harrison moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "What's happening?" Jessica asked. "Someone broke through the perimeter," Harrison explained, watching as security personnel rushed across the grounds. "Protesters, maybe press. Either way, it's created a distraction we can use." Harrison produced a civilian coat and a baseball cap. "Put these on. We need to move while security is focused elsewhere." Jessica hesitated only briefly before donning the disguise. Whatever came next, she knew she couldn't fight for transparency and accountability from inside a classified detention facility. They moved quickly through service corridors, Harrison using his access card to bypass secure areas. The academy was in chaos, with security personnel rushing to contain the breach at the main gate, while simultaneously trying to secure key facilities. "Where are we going?" Jessica asked as they approached a service exit. "There's a group of journalists at the south gate," Harrison explained. "Veterans and civil liberties attorneys too. If we can get you there, you can make a public statement before they try to silence you." As they neared the exit, voices approached from a connecting hallway. Harrison pulled Jessica into an empty classroom, closing the door quietly as a security team passed by. "This isn't just about one protest anymore," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Operation Cobalt leak has opened a larger conversation. People are asking questions about other classified operations, about accountability. In the chain of command." Jessica nodded slowly. "That was always the goal. Not to undermine the military, but to strengthen it by ensuring it actually lives up to its ethical obligations." Harrison checked the hallway before motioning her forward. "The next 24 hours will determine whether this becomes a footnote or a turning point. Everything depends on whether your message reaches the public uncensored." They reached the service exit without further encounters, emerging into the fading twilight. In the distance, Jessica could see the commotion at the main gate, protesters pushing against barriers, security personnel attempting to restore order, media capturing it all. "The south gate is 400 meters that way," Harrison pointed. "Stay close to the buildings. Security cameras are focused outward, not on the grounds themselves." As they moved cautiously along the shadows of the administrative buildings, Jessica noticed movement ahead, a security patrol moving in their direction. "We need to split up," Harrison said quickly. "They're looking for you, not me." I'll draw their attention while you continue to the south gate. They'll know you helped me, Jessica protested. Your career is a small price for doing what's right. Harrison finished. Your father taught me that years ago. It's time I honored his lesson. Before Jessica could argue further, Harrison strode purposefully into the open, calling out to the security patrol as if reporting a sighting. The team immediately changed direction, following Harrison as he led them away from Jessica's position. Alone now, Jessica moved quickly toward the south gate, keeping to shadows, using the skills she'd learned in tactical training but never expected to employ against her own institution. As she approached, she could see a smaller but equally passionate crowd gathered. Journalists with cameras, veterans holding signs supporting her stand, attorneys in suits consulting phones and tablets. Jessica took a deep breath, straightening her posture despite the civilian disguise. She had begun this journey by refusing a symbolic gesture of unquestioning obedience. Now she would take a much more active stand, not just against one ceremony or tradition, but against a system that valued compliance over conscience. With a final glance back at the academy that had been her home for years, Jessica stepped out of the shadows and walked deliberately toward the waiting cameras. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, hands unraised, voice clear and determined. The first reporter spotted her approaching, eyes widening in recognition. Cameras. Ethics aren't purely subjective, Jessica countered. The laws of armed conflict, the Constitution, the Uniform Code, these provide objective standards. What's missing is a consistent process for applying them, especially when operations are classified. The debate continued for hours, with positions gradually clarifying. Some, like Prescott, viewed Jessica's actions as a dangerous precedent that threatened military cohesion. Others saw potential value in reforming how ethical conflicts were handled within the ranks. Through it all, Jessica remained composed, articulating her position with the same precision she'd once applied to academic assignments. She wasn't fighting against the military, but for a version of it that better fulfilled its highest ideals. As the meeting neared its conclusion, Secretary Williams addressed Jessica directly. Ms. Chen, you've presented thoughtful arguments today. But I must ask, do you regret your refusal to salute? Do you acknowledge that your method of raising these concerns created significant disruption? Jessica considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would likely determine her fate. I regret that no other method seemed available, she said finally. I regret that classified operations could be used to shield potential wrongdoing from accountability. I regret that my father felt compelled to risk everything to expose similar issues. She paused. But I do not regret standing for integrity, even at personal cost. That's what the military taught me to do. The secretary exchanged glances with the Joint Chiefs before turning back to Jessica. Thank you for your candor. This meeting is adjourned while we consider next steps. As Jessica was escorted from the room, Commander Harrison was waiting in the hallway. Their meeting was brief, supervised by security personnel, but his message was clear. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, you've already changed things. There are conversations happening at every level of command that weren't possible before. At what cost, though? Jessica asked. My future? Yours? Harrison smiled slightly. Your father used to say that real service always carries a cost. The question is whether the principle is worth the price. 3 days later, Jessica was summoned back to the Pentagon. The composition of the meeting had changed. Fewer military officers, more civilian leadership and ethics experts. Secretary Williams presided over what he described as a working group on military ethical frameworks. Ms. Chen, he began, after extensive deliberation, we've reached several conclusions regarding both your situation and the broader issues you've raised. Jessica sat perfectly still, her expression neutral despite her racing heart. First, regarding Operation Cobalt and similar classified missions, Congressional Review Panel will be established with appropriate security clearances to examine these operations for compliance with legal and ethical standards. The Secretary continued, Second, regarding military ethics training and procedures, a task force will develop recommendations for enhancing ethical decision-making frameworks throughout the service branches. Jessica nodded, surprised by these concrete steps but waiting for the other shoe to drop her personal consequences. Finally, regarding your actions at the graduation ceremony, Williams said, his tone shifting. While we recognize the principled nature of your protest, the method you chose undermined good order and discipline in a way that cannot be overlooked. Here it comes, Jessica thought. You will not receive your commission as planned. Your graduation status will be held in abeyance pending completion of a specialized ethics leadership program that you will help design but will not initially lead. Jessica blinked in surprise. This wasn't the dishonorable discharge or criminal charges she had expected. Upon successful completion of this program, your status will be re-evaluated, Williams concluded. This represents an attempt to balance accountability for your actions with recognition of the legitimate concerns you raised. After the meeting, Admiral Rivera approached Jessica in the hallway. Not exactly what you expected, is it? No, ma'am, Jessica admitted. I was prepared for much worse. The military is changing, Rivera said. Slowly, reluctantly, but changing nonetheless. Your protest accelerated a conversation that was already beginning in some circles. She studied Jessica thoughtfully. Your father would be proud. You knew him well? Rivera nodded. We served together early in our careers. His ethical frameworks influenced my own approach to command, though I chose to work within the system rather than challenge it directly. And which approach proved more effective? Jessica asked. Perhaps we need both, Rivera replied. The inside voice for gradual reform and the outside voice that demands immediate accountability. Change rarely comes from a single source. The following week saw Jessica working closely with the Ethics Task Force, helping to design training programs that would encourage moral courage alongside tactical excellence. Her story had become a case study in military academies, spawning debates about the nature of duty and the limits of obedience. Commander Harrison, despite initial concerns about his career, was appointed to lead the implementation of the new ethics training, his expertise in this area suddenly valued rather than viewed with suspicion. The Congressional Review of Operation Cobalt proceeded behind closed doors, but periodic updates confirmed that significant reforms to oversight of classified operations were being implemented. Most importantly for Jessica, the investigation into her father's disappearance was reopened, with previously classified materials made available to a special investigative team. 6 months after her refusal to salute, Jessica stood at her father's memorial service. New evidence had confirmed what she had long suspected. Lieutenant Commander James Chen had not deserted or defected. He had attempted to report ethical violations in a classified operation and had been silenced permanently. The official record now acknowledged him as having died in service, though many details remained classified. The ceremony was small but significant. Admiral Rivera attended, as did Secretary Williams and several members of Congress, who had championed the military ethics reforms now being implemented. Commander Harrison stood beside Jessica as the honor guard presented her with the flag from her father's coffin. As the ceremony concluded, a young cadet approached Jessica hesitantly. Miss Chen, I just wanted to say, your stand meant a lot to many of us at the Academy. It's changed how we talk about our responsibilities. Jessica smiled, recognizing in the cadet's earnest face the same dedication to service that had driven her own journey. The uniform comes with both privilege and responsibility. Never forget that the highest loyalty is to the principles we serve, not just the chain of command. Later that evening, Jessica stood alone at her father's grave. The cemetery quiet as sunset painted the sky in brilliant orange and gold. She placed his compass on the headstone, its needle pointing true north, just as his moral compass had guided him, even at the cost of his life. "We did it, Dad," she said softly. "Not perfectly, not completely, but we started something that can't be undone. The salute still exists, but now it means something more, not just obedience, but integrity." A year after her graduation ceremony. Protest. Jessica was invited to address the newest class of cadets at the Naval Academy. The same parade ground where she had refused to salute now served as the platform for her to share the lessons of her journey. Standing before hundreds of young men and women preparing for military service, Jessica felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever before. "The oath you will take speaks of supporting and defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic," she began. "That oath places principles above persons, values above orders, integrity above convenience. It is the foundation of ethical military service." She paused, looking out at the sea of attentive faces. "You will face moments in your career when following orders seems easier than questioning them, when looking away feels safer than looking closely. In those moments, remember that true service requires more than obedience. It demands moral courage." The reforms Jessica had helped implement were far from perfect. Resistance remained entrenched in parts of the military establishment. Some classified operations still escaped proper oversight. But the conversation had fundamentally changed, with ethics now explicitly recognized as central to effective service rather than an abstract ideal. Jessica herself had found an unexpected path forward. After completing the specialized ethics leadership program, she had been offered a civilian position advising military leadership on ethical decision-making frameworks. Her unique perspective, part insider, part critic, provided valuable insights as the armed forces navigated evolving challenges. Commander Harrison had been promoted to captain and now oversaw ethics training for an entire service branch, transforming what had once been a perfunctory requirement into a central component of leadership development. Most significantly, the integrity protocol, established in the wake of Jessica's stand, had created formal channels for service members to report ethical concerns without fear of retaliation. Several operations had already been modified or canceled based on issues raised through this system. As Jessica concluded her address to the cadets, she raised her hand in a formal salute, not out of blind obedience, but as a conscious acknowledgement of the principles that now guided military service more explicitly than before. "The salute remains an important tradition," she told them, "but now it carries additional meaning. It represents not just respect for rank, but a mutual commitment to ethical service. When you raise your hand, remember that you're affirming not just the chain of command, but the moral foundation that gives that command its legitimacy." The cadets rose in unison, returning her salute with perfect precision. In that moment, Jessica felt the presence of her father, not just in memory, but in the living legacy of moral courage that continued to transform the institution he had served and challenged. Later, as she walked across the academy grounds with Admiral Rivera, Jessica reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. "When I refused to salute that day, I never imagined standing here a year later addressing cadets," she admitted. Rivera smiled. "The most powerful changes often begin with the simplest acts of conscience. Your father understood that. Now so do you." As they reached the memorial wall where her father's name had recently been added, Jessica ran her fingers across the engraved letters. Lieutenant Commander James Chen's official record now acknowledged his true service, not just as an officer who followed orders, but as one who stood for the principles those orders were meant to serve. "The work isn't finished," Jessica said quietly. "It never is," Rivera agreed, "but it continues, and that's what matters." Jessica nodded, thinking of the cadets she had just addressed, the reforms still being implemented, the conversations happening throughout the military about the relationship between discipline and ethics. Her stand had not created perfect change, but it had opened doors that had previously been sealed shut. As she left the academy grounds, a group of cadets passed by, offering her a respectful salute. Jessica returned it, the gesture no longer representing blind obedience but something far more meaningful, a commitment to service guided by both discipline and conscience, by both duty and integrity. The rain had stopped, the sun breaking through clouds that had lingered all day. Jessica paused to look back at the parade ground, where her journey had begun with a simple refusal that had evolved into a movement for reform. One cadet standing at the rear of the formation had reminded her of herself, watchful, thoughtful, questioning. In that young woman's eyes, Jessica had seen the future of military service dedicated, disciplined, but guided by an unwavering moral compass. The principles her father had championed, that she had defended at great personal cost, would continue to spread through each new generation of service members. The salute would remain, but its meaning had been forever expanded to embrace, not just obedience but the higher calling of ethical service. And that, Jessica reflected as she walked toward the future, was worth every sacrifice along the way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. 3 years after her stand at the graduation ceremony, Jessica found herself in a different kind of uniform, a tailored navy blue suit with a small American flag pin on the lapel. As senior advisor to the newly established Military Ethics and Accountability Office, she now worked at the intersection of military discipline and moral responsibility, helping to implement the reforms her actions had sparked. The Pentagon hallways still felt foreign compared to the Academy's historic corridors, but Jessica moved through them with increasing confidence, nodding to officers and civilian staff as she made her way to a critical meeting. "They're waiting for you," her assistant said, handing her a tablet with the latest briefing materials. "General Marshall looks unhappy." Jessica smiled slightly. When doesn't he? General William Marshall had been among the most vocal critics of the ethics reforms, viewing them as unnecessary constraints on operational freedom. As commander of Special Operations Command, his resistance carried significant weight, making this meeting particularly important. The conference room fell silent as Jessica entered. Around the table sat military brass, congressional representatives, and fellow ethics advisors. At the head of the table, Admiral Rivera, now Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs, nodded in greeting. "Ms. Chen, thank you for joining us," Rivera said. "We were just discussing the Yemen situation." Jessica took her seat, quickly scanning the materials on her tablet. Operation Silent Shield, a covert mission targeting terrorist leadership in Yemen, had been temporarily suspended following concerns raised through the Integrity Protocol. The details remained classified, but the fundamental issue was clear: potential civilian casualties that exceeded established thresholds. General Marshall wasted no time. "This is exactly why the Integrity Protocol is damaging operational effectiveness. We've spent 6 months planning this mission. The targets are confirmed high value. The delay puts our intelligence at risk of becoming outdated." Jessica met his gaze calmly. "General, the protocol is working precisely as designed. The operation wasn't canceled. It was paused for ethical review because the projected civilian casualty rate exceeded acceptable parameters." "Parameters set by people who've never been in combat," Marshall countered. "Parameters set by the laws of armed conflict, international treaties we've signed, and our own military regulations," Jessica corrected. "The review panel includes decorated combat veterans, General. They understand operational realities." A congressional representative leaned forward. "What's the status of the review?" Admiral Rivera answered. The panel has recommended mission modification rather than cancellation. They've identified an alternative approach that accomplishes primary objectives while reducing projected civilian impact by approximately 60%. Marshall shook his head. At increased risk to our personnel, marginally increased, Rivera qualified. Within acceptable operational parameters. Jessica watched the exchange with mixed emotions. 3 years ago, this conversation would never have happened. Operations like Silent Shield would have proceeded without ethical review, potential civilian casualties dismissed as collateral damage, and anyone who raised concerns labeled as lacking commitment. The integrity protocol had changed that dynamic. Now, ethical considerations were integrated into operational planning rather than treated as an afterthought. It wasn't perfect. Resistance remained entrenched in parts of the military establishment, but the shift was undeniable. The modified operation has been approved, Rivera announced. Execution authorized for next week, contingent on stable conditions. As the meeting adjourned, General Marshall approached Jessica. Unlike their previous encounters, his expression held something closer to grudging respect than hostility. Chen, walk with me. They moved through the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors in silence for several moments before Marshall spoke again. 3 years ago, I thought your graduation stunt would destroy military discipline. I was wrong at least partially. Jessica waited, knowing better than to interrupt the general's rare moment of reflection. The protocol has improved some operations, he admitted. Forced us to think more creatively, consider alternatives we might have dismissed. I still think it slows things down too much, but, he shrugged. The results are hard to argue with. Thank you for saying that, General. Marshall stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Your father was under my command, you know. Before his final mission, Jessica's breath caught. Despite years of investigation, much about her father's disappearance remained classified, with details emerging in fragments rather than comprehensive disclosure. I didn't know that, sir. He raised concerns similar to the ones captured in your protocol. I dismissed them as unnecessary complications. Marshall's expression hardened. I was wrong then, too. Before Jessica could respond, the general continued walking, conversation clearly finished. But his words echoed in her mind as she made her way back to her office. Each such acknowledgement, however reluctant, represented another small victory in the ongoing transformation of military culture. Her office overlooked the Potomac River, a deliberate choice that offered a reminder of the world beyond the Pentagon's walls. On her desk sat her father's compass, now accompanied by framed photographs of cadets she had mentored through the ethics leadership program. Jessica's assistant knocked lightly on the open door. Captain Harrison is here to see you. Harrison, now wearing the rank of captain, entered with the same measured stride she remembered from their first meeting. They had worked closely during the implementation of the ethics reforms, but his recent deployment had limited their contact to occasional video conferences. The mighty Pentagon suits you, Harrison observed, glancing around her office with approval, though I miss seeing you in uniform. Jessica smiled. Some battles are better fought in different attire. How was the deployment? Educational. Harrison settled into a chair across from her desk. The integrity protocol faced its first real field test. There were growing pains, certainly, but junior officers actually used it rather than just checking boxes. And senior leadership? Harrison's expression grew more serious. Mixed. Some embrace it, some tolerate it, some actively undermine it. But that was always going to be the case. Cultural change takes time. Jessica nodded, thinking of her earlier encounter with General Marshall. More time than we might have hoped, but less than we feared. The Yemen operation is proceeding with modifications, Harrison noted. That's significant progress considering how that would have played out 3 years ago. It's not enough, Jessica said quietly. Not yet. Harrison studied her with the perceptive gaze that had first recognized her potential at the academy. Something's bothering you. More than the usual resistance to reform. Jessica hesitated before sliding a folder across her desk. New information about my father's mission. Still heavily redacted, but enough to confirm what we suspected. He discovered evidence of civilian casualties being deliberately miscategorized during a classified operation. When he attempted to report through official channels, he was removed. Removed, Harrison repeated, understanding the euphemism. By whom? That remains classified. Jessica's voice tightened. But the pattern is clear. The system that silenced him still exists, just beneath the surface of our reforms. Harrison reviewed the documents thoughtfully. Your father's case is from another era, Jessica. Before the Integrity Protocol, before public awareness, before congressional oversight improvements. Is it really so different now? Jessica stood, moving to the window. We've created pathways for ethical concerns, yes. But the classification system still shields the most problematic operations from meaningful scrutiny. Whistleblower protections still have loopholes. The fundamental power imbalance remains. Harrison joined her at the window. You've accomplished more in 3 years than most reformers achieve in a lifetime. The military you're helping to build today would have protected your father rather than silenced him. Perhaps, Jessica conceded, but it's not just about him anymore. It's about making sure no service member ever faces that impossible choice. Between conscience and career, between moral duty and military discipline. Harrison smiled slightly. Now you sound like the cadet who refused to salute. Jessica turned to face him. I never stopped being her. I just found a different way to continue the fight. Their conversation was interrupted by Jessica's assistant. Miss Chen, Admiral Rivera needs you in the Situation Room immediately. There's been an incident. The Situation Room hummed with tense activity as Jessica entered. Screens displayed satellite imagery of what appeared to be a military installation in a remote, mountainous region. Admiral Rivera motioned Jessica to a seat beside her. 30 minutes ago, a Navy SEAL team conducting a classified reconnaissance mission encountered unexpected resistance. They're currently pinned down with at least 2 wounded. Jessica quickly assessed the displays. This isn't Yemen. Where are they? Rivera hesitated. The operation is technically beyond authorized engagement parameters. They're in Pakistani territory, a senior intelligence officer clarified. Pursuing high-value targets who crossed the border from Afghanistan. Jessica understood immediately why Rivera had summoned her. The operation had violated established boundaries, potentially creating an international incident. Now wounded personnel required extraction, which would further complicate an already problematic situation. What are the extraction options? She asked. General Marshall, who had arrived moments before Jessica, pointed to the satellite imagery. Standard helicopter extraction is high risk due to anti-aircraft capabilities in the area. We're considering a ground team insertion, but that extends our footprint in unauthorized territory. Or we could request Pakistani cooperation, Jessica suggested. The room fell silent. Involving Pakistani authorities would mean acknowledging the unauthorized operation, potentially damaging diplomatic relations and exposing classified capabilities. That would compromise the entire mission framework, Marshall objected. Personnel are already compromised, Jessica pointed out. And withholding information from Pakistani authorities while conducting unauthorized operations in their territory violates multiple agreements. Rivera studied the satellite imagery thoughtfully. The ethics review would flag this as a clear protocol violation if it were proposed in advance. But now that we're in it, mission commanders want latitude to resolve it their way, Jessica observed. This was precisely the type of scenario that had motivated her initial stand situations, where operational expedience conflicted with ethical and legal obligations. where the easy path diverged from the right one. I recommend diplomatic engagement alongside a limited extraction operation, Jessica said finally. Inform Pakistani authorities at an appropriate level. Coordinate the extraction to minimize further territorial violation and accept accountability. For the boundary crossing, Marshall shook his head. That creates diplomatic complications we don't need. With respect, General, those complications already exist, Jessica countered. The question is whether we address them honestly or compound the problem with additional deceptions. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with various options analyzed and rejected. Throughout, Jessica advocated for transparency and adherence to international agreements, even when operational convenience pushed in the opposite direction. Eventually, Admiral Rivera made the decision. We'll proceed with Miss Chen's recommendation. Limited extraction operation with diplomatic notification. As the necessary orders were issued, Jessica caught Harrison watching her from across the room, a subtle nod acknowledging the significance of the moment. 3 years ago, such a decision would have been unthinkable. Operational security would have automatically overridden ethical considerations. The extraction proceeded with tense efficiency. Pakistani authorities, while unhappy about the boundary violation, cooperated with the limited operation after receiving appropriate diplomatic assurances. The wounded personnel were successfully evacuated, though the broader mission objectives remained unfulfilled. In the aftermath, Jessica found herself summoned to a meeting with the Secretary of Defense. As she entered his office, she was surprised to find President Michaels present as well, his expression serious but not hostile. Miss Chen, the president greeted her. I understand you played a significant role in today's extraction decision. I provided ethical analysis of the options, Mr. President, which fundamentally altered the operational approach, the secretary added. Some commanders are suggesting that your influence compromised mission effectiveness. Jessica maintained her composure. The mission was compromised the moment it violated authorized parameters, sir. The extraction approach preserved our diplomatic relationships while protecting our personnel. The president studied her thoughtfully. This is the second time your ethical stance has created significant waves, Ms. Chen. First at your graduation, now in operational decision-making at the highest levels. The situations are connected, Mr. President. Both involved choosing between expedient options that violate our principles and more difficult paths that honor them. The president exchanged glances with the secretary before continuing. We're establishing a presidential commission on military ethics and accountability. After today's incident, it's clear we need to address these questions more systematically. I'd like you to serve as executive director. Jessica stared at them in surprise. Mr. President, that position would place me in direct conflict with significant portions of military leadership. Yes, the president agreed, it would. That's precisely why you're the right person for it. You've demonstrated both the courage to stand on principle and the pragmatism to implement real change. The opportunity was both unexpected and profound. Chance to expand the reforms beyond the Pentagon to the highest levels of national security decision-making. It would mean more resistance, more conflict, but also the potential for more meaningful transformation. I would be honored, Mr. President. In the weeks that followed, Jessica worked to establish the framework for the commission while continuing her Pentagon duties. The incident in Pakistan had unexpectedly accelerated reforms that might otherwise have taken years to implement, creating both opportunity and backlash. One evening, as she worked late in her office, Jessica received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Chen, her father's younger brother and a State Department official she had rarely seen since childhood. Uncle Thomas, she greeted him with surprise. What brings you to the Pentagon? Thomas closed the door before speaking. I have something your father wanted you to have. Something I couldn't give you until now. He placed a small data drive on her desk. This contains your father's complete records of the operations that led to his disappearance. He gave it to me for safekeeping, with instructions to pass it to you when you were ready." Jessica stared at the drive. "Why now?" "Because the classification on those operations has finally been reduced enough that possessing this information won't automatically make you a security risk," Thomas explained. "And because your new position with the Presidential Commission means you'll have the authority to actually use it." Jessica picked up the drive carefully. "This could implicate people still in positions of power." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That's exactly why your father documented everything so meticulously. He knew the system would protect itself unless the evidence was irrefutable." After her uncle left, Jessica sat alone with the drive, contemplating its implications. The information it contained might provide personal closure regarding her father's fate, but it would also create new conflicts with military leadership, just as her commission was getting established. The compass on her desk seemed to whisper, "Her father's guidance. True north doesn't change based on convenience." 2 days later, Jessica met Harrison at Arlington National Cemetery, where they walked in silence to her father's grave. The fall leaves crunched beneath their feet, golden and red against the cemetery's solemn green. "I have his complete records," she said finally. "Everything he documented before his disappearance." Harrison's pace slowed. "That's classified material. It's evidence of potential war crimes and their cover-up," Jessica countered. "Evidence that could finally bring accountability for operations that violated everything we claim to stand for. Using it will make powerful enemies," Harrison warned. "Enemies who could undermine everything you've built with the ethics reforms and the new commission." Jessica stopped at her father's headstone, now properly marked with his rank and honors. "The reforms will always be vulnerable as long as those responsible for the worst abuses remain unaccountable." Harrison nodded slowly. "What will you do?" "What my father would have done," Jessica replied. "What I've always done. Follow the compass, not the crowd." The Presidential Commission on Military Ethics and Accountability was formally announced the following week, with Jessica introduced as its executive director. The press conference drew significant media attention, with questions focusing on the Commission's authority and Jessica's controversial background. "Ms. Chen," one reporter asked, "given your history of challenging military leadership, how can you assure service members that this commission won't undermine operational effectiveness?" Jessica stepped to the microphone, conscious of the military. Leaders watching from the sidelines, some supportive, others deeply skeptical. "Ethical service and operational effectiveness aren't opposing values, they're complementary," she replied. "When we operate according to our highest principles, we strengthen rather than weaken our military capabilities. We build trust with allies, maintain moral clarity for our personnel, and ultimately better serve the Constitution we're sworn to defend." Another reporter raised a hand. "Will the Commission investigate past operations, or focus only on establishing new guidelines?" The question touched directly on her father's records and the accountability issues they raised. Jessica had spent days considering how to address this inevitable question. "The Commission's primary focus is forward-looking reform," she began. "However, we cannot build effective ethical frameworks without understanding where previous systems failed. Therefore, we will selectively review cases that illustrate systemic problems requiring attention." After the press conference, Admiral Rivera approached Jessica. "That was a carefully worded answer about past operations." "Yes, it was." Rivera studied her with the perceptive gaze that had first recognized Jessica's potential during the graduation. "Crisis, you've found something specific, haven't you?" Jessica met her gaze directly. "Information that certain operations systematically violated both law and ethics, with evidence deliberately classified to prevent accountability." "Your father's records," Rivera guessed. "Be careful, Jessica. Pursuing this alongside your broader reforms could jeopardize everything. Or it could demonstrate that the reforms have real teeth, Jessica countered. That ethical service isn't just an abstract ideal, but a practical requirement with consequences for violations. Rivera sighed. You haven't changed as much as some people think, have you? Still the cadet who wouldn't salute. Jessica smiled slightly. I've changed tactics, not principles. Sometimes transformation requires working within the system. Other times, it requires challenging it directly. As she left the press conference, Jessica passed a group of Military Academy cadets who had attended as observers. One young woman stepped forward hesitantly. Ms. Chen, I just wanted to say that your stand inspired me to pursue military service. Differently, to see ethical leadership as central to my duties, not peripheral to them. Jessica recognized in the cadet's earnest expression the same dedication that had driven her own journey. Remember that the uniform represents values more fundamental than any individual order or operation. When those values conflict with expedient choices, choose the values every time. The cadet nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. That evening, Jessica sat in her apartment reviewing her father's records. The detailed documentation painted a disturbing picture of operations conducted without proper oversight. Civilian casualties deliberately miscategorized, and whistleblowers systematically silenced. Among the files was a personal message her father had recorded shortly before his final mission. Jessica played it with trembling hands. Jessica, her father's voice filled the room. If you're watching this, then I failed to bring these matters to light through official channels. I'm attempting one last approach tomorrow, but I'm recording this as insurance. He paused, his expression pained but resolved. The compass I gave you isn't just a family heirloom. It's a reminder that true north doesn't change based on convenience or expediency. The military taught me that principle, even as some of its leaders betrayed it. Jessica touched the compass sitting on her desk, tears forming despite her efforts to maintain composure. Whatever happens to me, her father continued, know that ethical service sometimes requires standing apart from the crowd, refusing to participate in what you know is wrong, even when doing so carries personal cost. That's not disloyalty to the uniform. It's the highest form of fidelity to what it represents. His final words resonated with everything Jessica had come to believe through her own journey. The salute isn't just a gesture of respect for rank, it's an affirmation of shared values and shared purpose. When those values are betrayed, the gesture becomes hollow. Remember that, Jessica. And whatever path you choose, follow your compass, not the crowd. The recording ended, leaving Jessica with both grief and renewed determination. Her father had faced the same fundamental choice she had encountered at her graduation ceremony: comply with expectations or stand for principle. He had chosen principle at the ultimate cost. The next morning, Jessica convened the first official meeting of the Presidential Commission. Around the table sat representatives from all military branches, civilian ethics experts, legal scholars, and congressional liaisons. The agenda before them was ambitious, creating comprehensive ethical frameworks for military operations, enhancing accountability mechanisms, and revising training to emphasize moral courage alongside tactical excellence. Before we begin, Jessica said, I want to clarify the Commission's fundamental purpose. We are not here to constrain military effectiveness or second-guess operational decisions. We are here to ensure that American military power is exercised in accordance with our highest principles, not just because it's right, but because it makes us stronger. She looked around the table, meeting each person's gaze directly. Some will resist these efforts. They'll argue that ethical constraints hamper effectiveness, that moral considerations compromise security, that questioning problematic operations undermines military cohesion. We must be prepared to counter those arguments not with ideology, but with evidence. Jessica opened a folder containing carefully selected portions of her father's records documents that illustrated systemic problems without exposing currently classified operations. These case studies demonstrate how ethical failures ultimately compromised mission objectives, damaged international relationships, and betrayed the trust of both the American people and service members themselves. They show why reform isn't just morally necessary, but operationally essential. As the commission began its work, Jessica felt her father's presence not just in memory, but in the living legacy of moral courage that continued to transform the institution he had served and challenged. The salute remained an honored tradition, but now it carried additional meaning, representing not just the chain of command, but the ethical foundation that gave that command its legitimacy. The path ahead would not be easy. Resistance remained entrenched, accountability incomplete, reform vulnerable to reversal. But something fundamental had changed in the years since. A lone cadet had refused to raise her hand during a rain-soaked ceremony. That simple act of conscience had evolved into a movement for reform, a presidential commission, and a new generation of leaders who understood that true service required more than obedience. It demanded integrity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.